Hello, welcome to Season 5, Episode 5 of the Midwest Gaming Classic Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garris, Panel Director of the Midwest Gaming Classic. Today we take you back more than 3 decades to one of the most infamous chapters in video game history, the North American video game crash of 1983. You've probably heard the myths. One company's failure almost killed the industry. But how accurate is that story? In this special podcast, we revisit the Atari got a raw deal conversation featuring Retronauts Podcast hosts Jeremy Parish, Bob Mackey, Kevin Bunch, and Atari historian Martin Goldberg, recorded live from the 2018 Midwest Gaming Classic. These seasoned gaming historians don't just tell the crash, they challenge the conventional narrative and unpack what really happened when the market collapsed under its own weight. By 1983, Atari was the unrivaled titan of home consoles, its Atari 2600 dominating living rooms across North America. But a flooded marketplace, a glut of poorly made cartridges, and fierce competition from other systems and home computers triggered a dramatic downturn that nearly wiped out the second generation of game consoles. Revenue for home video games plummeted from billions to just millions in a few short years, and Atari itself suffered catastrophic losses. Today's discussion goes beyond simplistic blame. Was it really all Atari's fault? Or did a confluence of oversaturation, quality control breakdowns, and shifting consumer preferences create a perfect storm? Along the way, we'll also spotlight some of the brilliant Atari innovations, like the Atari 7800 that never got their due amid the chaos. So grab your favorite retro controller, settle in, and let's press start on a deeper look at a critical turning point in gaming history. And you know what? Enough of me talking. Why don't we get to the podcast?
Retronauts Podcast hosts Jeremy Parish and Bob Mackey are joined by Atari historians Kevin Bunch and Marty Goldberg to discuss the impact and legacy of Atari in the 1980s.
This week in Retronauts, Atari got a raw deal. Hi everyone, and welcome to, what is this, the third time Retronauts has been live at Midwest Gaming Classic?
It is number 3.
It is the year 2018, and we're on our third go. And it's a much bigger crowd than usual, and even with the door open at the back, it's much quieter and saner in here than it's been in the past. So I have a good feeling about this presentation.
Presumably I won't be harassed by drunks after this panel.
Actually,
Prove me
Bob,
wrong, audience.
I have plans tonight.
Oh, God.
So yes, hello. If you are not familiar with the Retronauts Podcast, my name is Jeremy Parish, and that's my co-host down there.
Hey, it's Bob Mackey. Hello.
And
wow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we are talking about Atari this week, so we have a few experts with us. To my left, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Marty Goldberg. I'm a partner in the Atari Museum and a co-author of Atari Inc. Business is Fun and 2 other forthcoming books on the same subject of 2 companies that came after that, Atari Corp and Atari Games.
So we brought in the heavy hitters this time, which wasn't hard since he's always here at the show. And also to my right is, oh, you don't have a mic?
No, I get to steal a mic. I'm Kevin Bunch. I do the Atari Archives videos on YouTube. I enjoy Atari history, so I'm something of an amateur historian.
Well, actually, this panel is kind of your fault, Kevin. I bumped into you last year on the vendor floor, and you were trying to complete your Atari 7800 collection. Are you done with that now?
Yep.
All right. So this is a man who owns all the 7800 games, and so I was originally thinking it would be cool to have a panel on the Atari 7800, but then I thought that might be kind of dry. Why don't we find something with a little more drama to it? And so that's what this panel is about. It's about looking back at the history of Atari and saying, you know, the Atari crash, the video games crash in 1982-83 did a number on Atari, but was that entirely their fault? And did they really deserve the sort of fallout that happened to them? And personally, I say no. I think it's kind of in vogue to say, well, if they hadn't published E.T. and Pac-Man, done such bad jobs with those Atari 2600 games, nothing bad would have happened to the games industry. But I don't think that's true, and I think everyone else here on the panel with me kind of agrees with that point of view. So we are going to look back and reconsider Atari and maybe try to rewrite history a little bit and give them a fair shake. So without further ado, why don't we roll into this conversation? So yeah, the Atari crash is, I guess, a good place to kind of start the video games crash, or I think in Japan it's called the Atari shock. Basically, it has to do with Atari, and it has to do with a lot of people losing money hand over fist. And I think we're all familiar with the idea behind that, but I don't know if someone else wants to jump in and kind of give a top-down view of what that was all about.
I think Marty.
I think Marty, this would be a great thing for him to talk to.
So what specifically do you want me to start out with it?
Let's just talk about what the Atari crash was.
Okay.
And kind of what happened after it.
Very loosely to cover, because we're going to go over details after this. Basically, what you had was an environment of an explosion of demand in the early 80s in video games in the consumer industry. Now, it's a very important point to make. At that point in time, there was not what you would call now a video game industry. You had various industries with video games in them. You had very few companies, Atari was one of them, that actually straddled multiple industries and could be considered what you would consider now a video game company in those respects. They were in other things. No, they were the Apple of that day. I mean, how you think of Apple today? They were involved not just in entertainment. They were also involved in medical equipment research, telephones, modern telephones. A lot of the features that you had in your phones today were actually pioneered back then. They were going in holography. They were going in all sorts of different consumer and advanced areas. They even had Alan Kay, who is legendary from Xerox PARC, who created, partially responsible for the team that created the modern Windows mouse and everything else environment. They had him there researching the office of the future for 10 years like he had been doing at Xerox. So they were far ahead of things in that. So, Atari was one of the few companies that straddled that. But at that point in time, you did not have an industry like you had now. You had other industries that happen to have video games in them. So it was pretty much the Wild West. And that demand just spiked across 81 through 82. And then you had basically a perfect storm going on into 82 and 83, where you had all these third-party companies come in too, and you had the issues with the already established companies that we're going to discuss in a bit. And they came together to basically not just flood the industry, but create this perfect storm of loss of demand is what it is. Because again, it was a new environment for a lot of these companies to operate in, and within another year, a lot of them were already exiting doing any sort of video games. So that what you had was you had an industry going away. You still had a demand and a market, but that was rapidly shrinking too over 83 and 84 then, so that by the time, there was still plenty of product, but the companies that were behind it weren't necessarily there anymore. And, because that's another thing too. There's this idea that before Nintendo came in, there was nothing there. There was like a gap. There was still a market. It was a lot smaller, but there were still video games being sold, consumer video games. And that's an important point too. This was a consumer crash.
Right.
Not coin. The coin industry, we've got a ton of the old arcade games here, as I'm sure a lot of you have seen. That's a completely different industry. They run on their own market. They run on their own resources, separate from what the consumer was. And even then, it was a North American crash, because it didn't necessarily have to affect worldwide. Europe was their video game market was mainly on computers during that time. So they weren't as affected. Same for Asia and around there too. They had a different market as well. It was mainly the North American consumer market, consumer video games that crashed.
Yeah, while the American market was crashing in 1983, Japan was just getting its first homegrown consoles. the Famicom. Nintendo's made its entry. The Sega SG-1000, the MSX standard, like all of these things were starting over there and beginning to take off right as America's market was cratering. So it was really the American console market. So when people talk about the video games crash and tend to think of it, like, oh, video games went away everywhere for a few years. That's absolutely not true. But, it was definitely the American console industry, and it affected more than just Atari. When the big crash happened, in addition to taking Atari with it, it also affected Mattel, who had the Intellivision. It affected Coleco, who had the ColecoVision. There were lots of other companies. Whoever made the Vectrex, what was the company there?
GCE.
GCE, okay. So like all of them were affected. And of course, Atari had been acquired by Warner Communications in 1976. And it was, I think at that point, the largest corporate merger that had ever happened in the world. So they were a huge company. And, the biggest symbol of the crash that happened in 83 was that Warner lost, I think, 60 or 65% of its stock value. So Atari managed to take down with this, the collapse of the 2600 market, one of the biggest media conglomerates in the world. So it was it was very localized and specific, but there were a lot of side effects and a lot of detrimental effects. And the name Atari has been sort of attached to this, like it is the Atari crash, the Atari shock. And so they tend to get the blame for it. But again, I don't think that's all entirely fair. Like they made some poor choices, but there were lots of other people out there making equally bad decisions, if not worse. And so it was a whole lot of, I don't know, I would say it was people kind of finding this new form of entertainment, this new space in the market, this new industry, and not really having a sense of what was sustainable while they were, sort of freewheeling and spitballing and trying to figure out like what works in video games. They were also discovering the hard way, what does not work in video games.
I'd like to posit one thing. I think the crash had a positive effect, actually, in some ways. Not for the companies who made the games, obviously, but I think the crash actually opened up a whole new demographic to console gaming, people that couldn't previously afford the systems. Growing up in a poor family, it was like, yes, an Atari is $50. All of the cartridges are like $1 everywhere, so you could easily stock up on every game you wanted if you had a small budget.
Yeah, I mean, that's like from the consumer side, that seems good, but that's definitely not, sustainable as a business.
I'm pro-consumer, Jeremy.
I am too, but there is, kind of the reality that if no one's making money, then no one's going to be making more of these things that we love. So there is the kind of push and pull of capitalism. Like there's got to be some upside for people so that they can devote their lives to making video games to entertain the rest of us. And this is cyclical. Like we see this all the time. We see it on Steam. We see it. It's probably going to happen with Nintendo Switch as that's gone from being like this very profitable place to suddenly in just the past few months flooded with all kinds of software. And it's getting hard to say like, I want a Switch game, but which Switch game do I want? There's 30 coming out this week. Which of the 30 do I want? I think that's just the gold rush effect. Anytime there's money to be made, there's profit to be made, people jump in and things get crowded. And that definitely is what happened with the Atari 2600 for sure. Do we want to talk about some of the causes of the crash beyond, E.T. and Pac-Man?
Sure. I think Kevin was.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that were going on at the time. So, everyone looks at Atari and they blame Atari's quality control at the time, but the fact of the matter is they were putting out a lot of pretty good games in 82 and 83. Like 82, you had Berserk, you had Yar's Revenge, you had Defender. 83, you had games like Ms. Pac-Man and Gravatar that people consider to be pretty darn good games. But everyone just looks at Pac-Man and they look at E.T. and they're like, oh, these must be the problem. Well, the problem really goes beyond Atari because you also had this massive glut of third parties that hit the market in late 82 and into 83 that was just releasing wave after wave of games that, some of them were good, some of them were mediocre, but there was just so many you wouldn't really be able to tell which is which. They're all full price. The magazines couldn't really keep up with it. Like you might they might get around to reviewing a game months after it came out and might have been discounted by that point.
Yeah, you couldn't jump on Twitter in 1982 and say, "Hey friends, which game should I buy for Atari?" Like that form of feedback and critical analysis just wasn't there. I think there was one video game magazine running at the time.
No, there were. I'd say 82 is when you had more of the explosion of video game magazines. There were a bunch of them, but yeah, that point,
they were mostly focused on computers, though, weren't they?
Arcade.
Okay.
Arcade was where it was at in that time period because that's where most of the original games were being generated, and then people wanted to be able to play those at home. I'd say around 82, like when you start seeing 81, 82, when you start seeing Yar's Revenge and some of the original titles coming out, that's really when you started having the beginnings of a shift in the home industry where people wanted new games that weren't available in the arcades, that were specific to a platform, that were something that they could go and they could just play at home. But before that, they were mainly taking their lead from Coin because that's where all the money was, that's where all the development was being done, and that's where people were still socializing. Before your Xbox Live and everything else that you have now, that's what you would do. You would go to the arcade and play with your friends and hang out there for the day and play your games and visit and stuff like that too. So,
and I think you mentioned, Kevin, third parties, and I think that really does have a huge impact. I don't know if you can really point at one thing about the Atari crash and say that's it, but man, third parties were really part of the problem. And there were some third parties, which is to say, companies making games for Atari that were not Atari themselves. There were some very good third parties, but if you have ever, just kind of done a random trawl of the 2600 library, and once you start getting into the games that were not made by Atari or made by Activision, which was, a company formed by people who left Atari, you get into some pretty dire stuff, and it stops being fun really quickly. And you can really understand why people would go to the store, pay $30, which was a lot in 1983 money, in the middle of a recession, and bring home something that was incomprehensible, unplayable, just not fun at all. They would say, well, I don't want to buy more of these games because I just got burned.
Yeah, I'm not sure when the price drop started happening, but when the VCS launched, the 2600 launched, it was the equivalent of like $800 today, or maybe $900 today. So it was pretty expensive. It was like the price of a PC gaming rig almost.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was an investment, and there were always, in my experience as a kid living back then who did not have a 2600, you always kind of knew who your classmates were and who the kids in the neighborhood were who had a 2600. Because it was kind of a luxury item, and so the kids who had it, like everyone kind of somehow ended up at their house to play video games. It was a strange phenomenon.
Yeah, with regards to the third parties too, and as far as with your point with Activision too, the co-founder of that company is going to be here tomorrow. David Crane, he will be speaking tomorrow too. But in relation to that, I mean, Activision is really what opened that up. Because, people say, well, why didn't Atari lock out the 2600? Or why didn't they keep other people from manufacturing for it? Well, because before Activision came around and those employees left and started that company, that wasn't a concept. Okay, there was no such thing as third party. These were all, not necessarily proprietary platforms, but this was such a new industry that you needed so much money to get into and to develop for. It was never thought that somebody else was going to come along and just start developing games, because they didn't even know how long video games and home games were going to last, because they were constantly being called at that time a fad. So the idea that somebody would come along and start making games for it wasn't fathomable.
There was also a lot of protectionism happening in the market. Coleco came out with the expansion module for the ColecoVision that basically stuck an Atari 2600 on your ColecoVision. So you put in this adapter, and all of a sudden you could play Atari 2600 games. And of course, Atari took that to court. They weren't happy about that at all.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, you had that with hardware as far as patents, and even games. The games themselves, like you had Atari, once they got the license for Pac-Man, suing Magnavox for Casey Munchkin. Because again, this whole concept of protection in this field wasn't necessarily there beyond the hardware. And once the hardware done, I mean, Coleco had claimed that they had clean room reverse engineered everything. What happened is they wound up settling out of court, licensing, and then paying royalties on everything that was sold. So Atari actually made money off of that. But getting back to that with that third party thing, people that I've interviewed that were there at CES, the summer of '82, you had Atari doing the 5200, coming out with that. You had Coleco, surprisingly, because everybody thought they had exited video games, all of a sudden coming out with the ColecoVision and showing it off there. You had all sorts of things going on, but the thing that staggered most people was all of a sudden you had these third-party companies, a ton of them, show up at the Consumer Electronics Show. It was a summer one down south of here in Chicago at that time, at McCormick when they used to have it. And they were like, this isn't good, because nobody was prepared for it. And the market's just, it was already starting to get crowded with the companies that were there all competing with all these different consoles. And now you have all these third parties, and it's insane that in a year, 1982, a year that the actual overall earnings of video games were huge, you actually had a lot of companies starting to lose a lot of money because of that, because of fighting for all that market share and because of all their own issues too.
Yeah, the pie was getting bigger, but the number of people wanting a piece of the pie were exploding, exponentially compared to the size of the pie's growth. So that just wasn't sustainable. So I think you can kind of make a case that the existence and the proliferation of third parties kind of was Atari's fault, because Activision, like the people who formed that company, left because they weren't happy at Atari. And I think that ultimately goes back to the point that in 1976, Warner Communications bought Atari, and it went from being this like kind of freewheeling hippie company out in California to a more buttoned down corporation that had to, it was a division of a larger, very established firm, and it didn't treat its talent as talent. It treated them like commodities, like you are creating these game ideas and programming games and making art and music or sound effects. But there's nothing special about you. Anyone can do that. You're just, assembling products for us. And obviously we know that's not true. Video games are not just assembly line products, or they shouldn't be. And the best games come with a lot of heart, a lot of creativity, a lot of vision. And I think, the people who went off to form Activision felt that way very strongly and resented being treated like, assembly line people. And so they went off and formed their own company, and that started this chain effect a chain of events that ended up kind of destroying the market, just because once Activision was out there making games without a license from Atari, everyone said, oh, we can do that too. But again, they weren't Activision. They didn't have years of experience working with the Atari 2600 hardware. They weren't people from Atari who understood, not only consumer research, like what do people want, but how do you make a good game? How do you come up with a good idea? So that was really kind of, I guess if you wanted to point to an ultimate cause and effect here, it would be the Warner acquisition. In my opinion, I don't know. You guys may disagree.
I think you're right. I mean, it's a tale as old as time when a company is bought out by people who don't understand the product and are consumers of the product, and then proceed to ruin the product. So it happens all the time.
Well, I mean, technically, too, you could say Atari and the people at that time in 1976 didn't understand the product either, because they were just getting into it as far as the consumer market. That's part of why the acquisition happened. I mean, they had been in dire financial straits a number of years before that because of some bad decisions made and some poor management brought in. So that then they were looking for investors. They got a few of those, but not enough. And then they went and basically got hooked up through a mutual investment firm with Warner. Now, Warner keep in mind, Atari at that time was an engineering research firm. That was really how they were run. They were not run as a gaming company in those regards. They were there purely to go after all the different ideas that Nolan would come up with that he wanted to pursue. And they were run as an engineering firm, a startup. Warner is the one that came in and brought in the big boy pants for that. And a lot of the oversight that was actually needed. Unfortunately, they were also big boys that needed to fill bigger pockets. So they also were chiefly responsible for a lot of the issues and a lot of dual management, like what you talked about with the guys, how they were treated. The ones that left for Activision and other ones too, because there was an exodus across 78 and 79. That had a lot to do with what's called Hollywood accounting, and which you hear about in movies and films. These guys were promised a lot of different profit shares and things like that. They were seeing earnings happen for the company, but yet they weren't getting what they had been promised. And what had happened was the people that Warner would bring in, or Warner themselves, would shift stuff around to show losses. things like that. We can't give you what you're asking for yet, type of thing. And then you had these guys leave. Ray Cassar, who just passed away, he is chiefly responsible for the golden age of what we all think of with Atari. He's also responsible for its downfall, as is Warner and Manny Gerard in that group there. They were the ones that put the pressure on to keep the earnings piling up when that started happening in the early 80s. They were the ones that wanted to inflate their own earnings. They were the ones that would go in, and there were projects that were almost ready to be released, and they were like, why are we doing this? We shouldn't be doing this, and nix them. They were the ones chiefly responsible. They were the ones responsible for E.T. They were, because it was basically the head of Warner was at a party with Spielberg and had been trying to get him to come over to release his films through Warner, and hammered out a deal at his home in the Hamptons over the weekend to do this game, and that was already the beginning of the summer. And Spielberg was like, "Well, it's got to be out in time for Christmas." "Oh yeah, no problem." They thrust it on Atari, and then they have to go and negotiate. It takes more time. And then by that time, it's going over, and it's finally Howard's brought on board. He's got very little time left, because in order to make it for that time period, for the Christmas season, it's got to be into manufacturing by the beginning of September. So, they were the ones that were doing a lot of this stuff. They were responsible for its golden age, and they were responsible for its downfall and a lot of that too. Some of it was a necessary evil. So,
if you want to come up with some other things that maybe Atari shouldn't have done, I would say the other big one would be the 5200. Like, what even was that? Like, why did they do that? Kevin, do you know?
Well, my understanding is they really wanted to compete with Mattel's Intellivision, which came out around 79 in test markets, and then they released it nationally in 1980. And Mattel just kept running all these ads after ads, just directly comparing their games and their system to the 2600. And like, look, we have way better sports games. We have better animation. We have better visuals.
I think George Plimpton's claim was lifelike graphics.
They have lifelike.
They were
graphics.
Much more convincing stickmen than Atari had.
You can see He-Man sword fight Skeletor eventually, but so they're running all these ads. They've got this controller that has like this 6-way disc control pad and all these buttons and this keypad. And Atari says, "Well, you know what? We can one up them. We'll just repackage this Atari 400 computer." We'll make this weird controller that has this analog stick that doesn't recenter on its own, and has these buttons that'll turn to mush even if you don't use it. Which is my favorite thing about the 5200s. The controllers will just go out on you without you even touching them. And we're gonna sell all of these games that we've already been working on for our computer line.
And that's the important thing, is that it was based on the Atari computer line and therefore had no compatibility with the 2600. So they had two effectively competing consoles in the market. And it's not like, when Nintendo has Switch and 3DS on the market, and they're kind of in the same space, but not really. This was like two consoles that were very much, just one had a huge library of games, and the other had a smaller library but looked a little nicer. So it was very confusing for consumers. And like you said, there were a lot of sort of downsides to the 5200 hardware. So it wasn't an obvious case where, like Nintendo to Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis to Sega Saturn, like there's going to be a huge leap. No, it's like, which would you rather invest in? So that didn't do them any favors, I would say.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that this was also really the first time any company had been releasing a sort of successor console.
There was the Odyssey 2, but that might be so far back in the primal ooze that it doesn't really count.
I mean, the Odyssey was a dedicated machine from 71. Odyssey 2 was from 79.
78, 79.
Yeah, so it's a pretty wide gap at that point, and there was a lot of years between the two. But what this is like, okay, you've got the 2600 on the market. Here's our new system. Well, what do we do with the 2600? It's still making us money. Let's just try and support them both and see what happens. And then, ColecoVision came along. Like, oh no, this is better than what we've got.
Can I add to that?
Go ahead.
Sure. So a couple things in regards to that. They actually, the 5200 development, what was called System X, actually started before anybody knew about ColecoVision with that. It, like you said, it started as a Intellivision thing. There was a console before that called a 3200 that was originally going to be the successor that actually went out because it had I can't remember right now, I think a 12-bit graphics chip that was very hard to program. It was an 8-bit CPU and a 12-bit graphics chip, and it didn't get far. The design carried through, though, into what became the 5200 as far as the case design. When they started the 5200, there were 3 projects at that time. There was, they were basically doing the cost-reduced 2600 because in relation to what you were saying earlier, they understood the market as far as the need for having lower cost items on it so people could afford it easier. So they were actually moving towards that at that time. So 2600 is going to reposition as a lower end. Then you had what became the 5200 as a mid, and they were going to work on a higher end console as well. And then what happened is Warner basically is like, 2600 is our cash cow. You can't do anything to jeopardize that. So the plan changed, and they did the 5200, and it was positioned as a higher end, as the higher end gaming system, so it wouldn't affect the 2600 market. And it was designed from the beginning to have the 2600 compatible cartridge thing as well, to help so people wouldn't have to get rid of that and would continue to buy hopefully 2600 games as well. But that wasn't ready in time for the release, so then it got the myth that involved that, 5200 was not designed to be backwards compatible. It actually was, it just wasn't ready in time. But so that was the idea. That's how the 5200 came about. It was supposed to be a 3-pronged approach for that. So,
but yeah, obviously that didn't happen.
No.
And I think it's good that Kevin mentioned the computer line, because that is sort of the other big thing that was happening in video games right around this time. Like the 2600 launched the same year as the Apple II, and the Apple II was sort of the introduction of like, hey, computers for the masses. But the 2600 was a lot less expensive than the Apple II. But in 1981, Commodore brought out the Commodore 64, and suddenly there was a computer that could do a lot, had very great audio and video effects, and really didn't cost that much more than a console. So all of a sudden you had something that was far more versatile than a video game system that also played video games. And I think it became harder for people to make a case for keeping a console in the home, when instead they could invest that money into the C64 and some of the other computers that came along around the same time, like the TI-99/4A and what else, like the VIC-20 and so forth. So yeah, all of a sudden, the consoles weren't sort of existing in this space by themselves. There were other devices that suddenly could, affordably play video games in the home, and they could also, do your recipes or whatever they tried to pitch people on for computers back then. And I think that these are just all the things that kind of came together to cause the video game crash. And that took down Atari and Intellivision and ColecoVision and so on and so forth, and made retailers specifically very, very gun shy about buying video games, console video games, and trying to sell them, because they had these bins of the $1 video games that Bob mentioned. And it wasn't until Nintendo came along 3 or 4 years later and said, hey, but what if we pretended these weren't video games? It was an entertainment system with a video robot and a gun, and you buy game packs instead of cartridges. Like, that's totally different. That's not video games at all, guys. Like, retailers went for it, but consumers knew what was up. They were like, oh yes, video games. We actually still like those. It's just, no one wants to get into that business anymore. So there was that kind of like 3 or 4 year sort of trough, a lacuna in the US console market, where a lot of it had to do with retailers just getting burned and not wanting to get back into that space again.
I do want to point out that not only were there all these computers on the market, but there was also a glut of hardware consoles on the market in 82 and 83. Like, you had the ColecoVision, and you had the 2600 and the 5200 and the Intellivision and the Odyssey 2 and the Vectrex and the Arcadia 2001 and the Astrocade. And still the Channel F was still on the market. You could still buy that.
So, like I said, Warner's stock crashed hard in 1982-83 as a result of this, and they said, we need to get rid of this dead weight around our necks. So they spun off Atari, and Atari went in basically two directions. Like
Yeah,
as Marty
they
mentioned.
actually, the head of Warner couldn't get rid of Atari. Nobody would buy it off of him. They had just come off of a hostile, I'm sure you guys are familiar with Rupert Murdoch, in news recent years. He tried to take over Warner during that time period when it was very vulnerable. They fended him off, but it hurt them. And they brought in a company to basically evaluate what they could get rid of so that they weren't as exposed. One of the things, obviously, was Atari. So he tried, Steve Ross, the head of Warner, tried to get rid of it. Nobody wanted the company as a whole. So then he came up with the idea, okay, I'll just split it up. So basically what happened was he cold called Jack Tramiel, who had left Commodore earlier and had come back and started his own company, Tramiel Technology, to see if he'd be interested in buying the consumer division, the consumer assets. And they negotiated, and that actually happened. Now, it's to keep in mind, he did not sell Tramiel Atari. Atari Corporation, the company that came after, was a completely separate company, completely different company. He sold, Ross and Warner sold them the assets. Assets purchases are basically their IP, buildings, things like that. They don't include the employees. And basically you hire over employees to help maintain those assets that you are purchasing. So what he did was he put those assets into a new company he formed called Atari Corporation. Now the other part of the rest of the company actually continued on as Atari Inc. for a day, and then was renamed Atari Games Inc. And with, what's his name still at the head at that time? Trying to remember who was brought in to try and save Atari at that time.
I don't remember.
From the tobacco industry. Anyway, so what happened was it was renamed Atari Games Inc. and they slowly pared that down until it was just the arcade part. And then that had majority ownership sold to Namco. And Namco renamed it Atari Games Corp. And then that survived a number of years. It was actually the last vestiges of the original Atari left. I think it went out in 200003 was when it was finally
Something like
closed
that.
down.
But didn't it get absorbed by Midway or something?
They went back and forth. They got employee bought, there was it was basically a three-way for a time. It was third employee, a third Namco, and a third Warner. Warner still kept stake in it. And then they wound up, and the employees sold out to Warner, and they became Time Warner Interactive. And then that was sold to Midway, and then it got renamed to Atari Games again, and then eventually Midway Games West, and then it was gone in 2003.
Right.
So that's what happened with that.
And what a mess.
Yes.
But, the Atari Games itself, the company that existed, and carried forward that sort of tradition under Namco's watch, they made some amazing arcade games. They made stuff like Gauntlet and Rampart 720, Stun Runner. Yeah, there's Paperboy. Yeah, there is some great stuff that came out from this company. So they continued on, but it still feels like they were kind of a shadow of what they had been. They had been synonymous with video games. You played Atari, you didn't play video games. Even if you were playing in television, you were playing Atari, kind of like Nintendo would be in the 80s, like late 80s. It would be playing Nintendo, playing Atari. Those were nothing was more symbolic of the transfer of power, I think, between the two halves of the decade than how kids played video games, what they were playing. But there were still some really interesting things that came out of Atari Inc. as well, or Atari Corp. God, I keep getting the names all mixed up. It's a lot to keep track of, and I do kind of want to talk about those things because those pieces of hardware, like some of them were really great. And so this brings us back around to the Atari 7800, which was a really strong piece of hardware and was supposed to launch in 1984. Where it would have beaten, the Nintendo Entertainment System to the market by a good 2 years, Sega Master System by 2 years. Like it would have been sort of the first console of that sort of, I guess, second or third wave, however you want to designate that. And it, the hardware itself was very competitive and comparable to the NES, but it would have been here a couple of years in advance instead of launching around the same time that the NES went nationwide with a much stronger campaign behind it. I feel like Atari really didn't push the 7800 that hard. They were just kind of like, here's a console that just came out, it doesn't have Mario, but it's Atari, you want that, right?
I mean, Atari corporation didn't have it didn't have Warner money behind it, especially after the whole process of Jack Tramiel having to basically buy the 7800 separately, and he had to pay off General Computing Corporation, who designed it. He had to pay them off again to actually have games for it, and then he had to start rebuilding the development team because they ended up getting laid off during that whole period of time. So yeah, it got delayed until around May 1986 when they started releasing it, and then by the time it got nationwide, the NES was being sold nationally, and I think the Master System was too. So suddenly you had all this competition, and Nintendo definitely had more advertising dollars behind it.
And even Sega, that was being distributed by Tonka, who, it's a pretty big company. So they pushed it pretty hard. I saw ads. I don't think I ever saw a 7800 commercial on television, ever. I saw ads for Nintendo, for Sega, but not for Atari 7800.
I know they had commercials. I never remember.
I found them on YouTube, and I'm like, where did you people find this stuff? Like, did you go to the Atari archives and find videos that never broadcast? What happened here?
Yeah.
Bob says public access.
Yeah, I don't recall ever seeing any on television. We ended up getting our 7800 when we just went to a store and needed a new system to play 2600 games on, which I think might have been one of their key selling points at the time.
Yeah, the 7800 was a good piece of hardware, and this is kind of why I say Atari got a raw deal, because I feel like that system could have done a lot more. It could have thrived even. It could have been a really strong competitor to the NES. But because of the crash, it ended up being pushed from 1984 to 1986, and there were all those, political and financial maneuverings that went on with it.
And by the time it launched, the exclusives were just really old games, though, right?
Yeah, I mean, it launched with some really, really high quality conversions of arcade games, but a lot of them were games that people had already played on 2600. Whereas, you looked at Nintendo and Sega, and Nintendo, they had Mario, they had stuff like Excite Bike, like games that people hadn't played before, Balloon Fight, things like that. Sega had really great conversions, for 8-bit hardware of great Sega arcade games. Like, arcade games is what Sega did. And now you could play those games on a home console from the company that made those games. So, stuff like Hang On, that was like really impressive looking. And yeah, so it was really hard for 7800 and its kind of aging ports of Xevious or Galaga or whatever to sort of stand out. Like, those games would come to NES later, but it was just kind of like, here, flesh out your library with these popular arcade games from bygone days. Whereas with 7800, the proposition was, here's what you got. It's these popular arcade games from bygone days.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. But when you think about it, the console was in development in 83 into 84. So those games were actually top tier at that time.
Absolutely.
They were meant to be just introductory games, and it would still have the full development team, library and IP of Atari, the continuing evolving library of Atari, including the arcade games that they had, and the any ones that they would license, or the new ones the games that they develop. And then all of a sudden that wasn't there. Like you mentioned before, it didn't come with the IP purchase, because GCC, the company that developed it, its contract was with Warner. That's what I said before about this dual management. Warner would go and make deals and then have Atari execute them. They didn't necessarily order. That was including the Amiga deal that had happened too. That was with Warner as well. So those did not come with the purchase that Tramiel made. He had to negotiate for him, like you said. He had to, as far as the 7800, he had to go and he had to pay those things off. By that time, we're talking about the summer of 85. He's looking to start relaunching the 7800. So NES wasn't on any radar yet at that time. And he basically had nothing. So then he's got to get somebody over to start up a games division again. He got Mike Katz, who we interviewed for this show in the past. He came over from Epix. He was over there, and all of a sudden he saw, it's about September into October, and he's going to license games, and he can't, because they're all snapped up by this company called Nintendo that's going to be coming up with this console. So he came up with the idea, okay, I'm going to start licensing titles from that haven't been on consoles before, that have just been on home computers. And so he started bringing those in. But, even then, he didn't really have a development team to really speak of. He would outsource a lot of the development for any of the original games that they did, or any of the licensed games like that too. So there really wasn't anything there. As far as the commercials and marketing, yeah, they had that. I saw back in the day the National Video Game Team commercial one that they had, but I didn't see much else. Most of their ads were in like magazines and things like that for the 7800. But again, it was there was no budget. When Trammell took over the IP and started his new company, he also took over a lot of the debt from the consumer division as well. That came with it. Plus, he had to pay out licenses. Nintendo actually strong-armed Trammell that summer of '84. Because all the games of Mario for the 5200 and the 2600, the unsold games that came as part of the assets that he was going to sell, they considered that a sale. So they wanted their cut from that. So they strong-armed him for that. Just all sorts of stuff that people don't realize that it was a couple years before he could actually have his company in the black and have most of that Warner debt, the old Warner debt paid off, which was insane. I mean, he had to renegotiate with Warner several times, for a better deal because he just couldn't make it on the terms that they had with it. So there wasn't much to speak of until I'd say around '87, and by that time, yeah, Nintendo was pretty much the king of it all. So
yeah, it sounds like kind of a raw deal.
yeah,
And I'm glad you mentioned Epix because they also are responsible for another really, I think, remarkable piece of hardware that Atari brought out, the Atari Lynx, which began as the Epix Handy, and development on that began in 1986. And Atari ended up taking, kind of possession of that. There were some shenanigans there. It wasn't all necessarily in good faith, I think, just based on different stories that have come out. But, eventually they released this really great handheld system, full color screen, backlit. Apparently, from what I've read, the sprite blitter could process infinite sprites. I'm sure there was some sort of upward limit on it. But basically, like, the system would basically kind of scale and just draw more power to make all these sprites happen on screen. So very impressive, and completely demolished by Nintendo's Game Boy, which launched about the same time as the Lynx, even though it hadn't been in development as long, or at least not known to have been in development. And again, I feel like had the situation been better for Atari and they had been in a better space and had better finances, they could have gotten the Lynx out, say in 1988 instead of '89. And who can say what would have happened if the Atari Lynx had a year's lead on Nintendo's Game Boy? Like, yeah, Game Boy had Mario and it had Tetris, and those were great. But, if that came out after people had been playing Lynx with its full color screen and really impressive, almost like 16-bit quality visuals in a handheld system for a year, I think Game Boy would have been a much harder sell. But unfortunately, that's not how it worked out for Atari.
Well, it was a cost too, because it was a full color LCD screen in 1989. It was expensive, so it drove up the cost. They had actually tried to negotiate.
The battery costs also.
The battery costs too, yes.
They went up there.
Yeah, they had batteries added half the weight of the system. But it was, they had been in negotiations, or they had deals with their suppliers, or that was supposed to drive the cost down further, even after the Lynx 2. And it never came. They actually wound up suing them. But then you had basically Nintendo come in with their Game Boy with display technology that was maybe a step above the old calculator technology that handheld games were using before that. And they were able to keep the costs down, and then they had the games people wanted to play. So, I mean, that was pretty much it.
And I seem to recall reading that there was a parts shortage that Atari claimed was going on with the Lynx 2 around the time it came out. So even if you wanted to get a Lynx in '89, you wouldn't be able to find one until sometime next year. Hey, may as well check out this Game Boy thing. I can find it everywhere on the store shelves.
Yeah, and it looks like we are out of time. And I think we kind of hit all the points we wanted to. There is still like the Atari Jaguar, but I don't know if anyone necessarily wants to try to make a case for that one. So I think we will wrap.
What the?
Oh, there are some fans. Okay, you can talk to Bob about that. Out back after the panel. But yeah, anyway, thanks everyone for coming to this panel. Thank you to Marty and Kevin for your very informed opinions. Hopefully, we have shed a little light into your hearts and made you think, maybe Atari deserved a little better in the late 80s. Maybe they'd still be around if things had gone a little differently. But they didn't, and that's where we are now. So thanks, everyone, again, for coming to this panel. We will probably see you again next year, but we'll also see you tonight, if we can all fit into the space, in the 1983 bar and arcade at 8 o'clock.
Right.
We have some space reserved.
Yes, and we're also selling shirts and stickers and zines in the back of the convention hall.
And finally, after this is all wrapped up and everyone's cleared out, if you brought a Game Boy and a link cable, and you know why, I have a whole lot of copies of Faceball 2000 with me, so we're going to see if we can get a 16-player match going. It's probably not going to happen, but by God, we're going to try, and we're going to try again tonight at 1983. So I hope to see you there. Bring a Game Boy.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
And that's the end of this podcast episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, hearing all about the North American video game crash of 1983 from the Retronauts Podcast team of Jeremy Parish, Bob Mackey, Kevin Bunch, and Atari historian Martin Goldberg from the 2018 Midwest Gaming Classic. We enjoy having them every year and hope to see all of them at a future Midwest Gaming Classic convention. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. It helps the podcast out very much. And until next time, take care, stay safe, and game on.